So going from what the last session was pretty amazing and with some intense modelling in there, this is going to be a very grounded talk, so perhaps appropriate to the afternoon slot. The headliner there is wedged. It could have been squeezed or something like that. I guess this is a bit of an op-ed piece about small-scale fisheries and small-scale fishery futures, and some practical sides of solutions and some non-solutions, and some problems with solutions. So, yeah, I'd like to firstly just briefly introduce WorldFish. So I'm a senior scientist with the WorldFish based in Penang, Malaysia. I actually sit in Townsville at the Centre of Excellence as a visiting scientist, and there's a few of us there now. With a growing collaboration, we share interests in the Pacific region in particular, but also across the more theoretical areas of resilience and so on. And I guess the partnership is based on the fact that WorldFish is very grounded and is on the ground for the long term in a number of places. We can certainly benefit from the theoretical input from being a partner with the centre, and likewise we have some really grounded and long-term engagements that I think are recognised as being of importance to the centre. I'd like to just give a quick plug for our newest office in Timor-Leste, which is where I spend a fair bit of my time, and I think there's some fantastic opportunities for collaboration there. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to launch into a bit of a rah-rah effort for small-scale fisheries. It may appear to be rose-coloured spectacles. I don't deny many of the issues that exist with small-scale fisheries in terms of sustainability and in some cases similarities to large-scale fisheries, but I also want to wave a flag a bit, so excuse me for doing that. Okay, so fish and food security. There are three main areas where fish contribute directly to food security: through fish as food, through income and livelihoods, and through economic growth. Some headline figures: fish as food supplies 4.3 billion people with 15 to 20% of their animal protein needs. Now, obviously, those numbers are averages, and you look to areas like the Pacific where it can be 90+%, and obviously inland areas where it's significantly less in some cases, significantly more in the large deltas. Income and livelihoods. Again, headline level figures, which I'll dissect a bit as we go further in. 1.2 million direct jobs, supports, and these are very rubbery figures, 500 to 600 million indirect jobs. And I'll talk a bit about how some of those figures come up. And traded value, initial sort of beach value, estimated at around 100 billion a year, with a total value of some 600 billion. There are still unquantified multipliers within that. So, over the last half of the 20th century, the human demand for animal protein grew fivefold, which is a massive increase for the planet to sustain. And I'm not sure if you're aware, but fish really sits at the top of that and really drives that. So, yeah, dissecting that a little bit further, capture fisheries, and these are FAO data which come with their qualifiers and so on, but it's a good way to start the conversation. Capture fisheries are very much levelling off at around about the 100 million tonnes mark, while aquaculture is driving the growth. Now, of course, there's reduction from the capture fisheries, which feeds directly into aquaculture, also feeds into other animal feeds and so on. But I guess the point I'm making here is that capture fisheries still very much underpin the supply of fish, and the supply of fish is critical to the planet in terms of food production and animal protein supply. And the fish provides much more than just protein, so the quality of the nutrition that comes from fish sits it again above other animal source foods. So you have zinc, iron, vitamin A and calcium, which are provided in large quantities by fish in varying quantities. There are other trace micronutrients that are also important. This obviously varies by fish species, but it keys directly into global nutrition needs in many places. So we talk about hidden hunger, which is a malnutrition based on micronutrient deficiencies. And fish have the potential to plug many of the holes there, particularly where it comes to children. So vitamin A and zinc deficiencies are chronic amongst children in developing countries, and fish have the potential to contribute significantly in that area. Childhood stunting affects 450 million children around the world, and that, fish can play a strong role there and do. So when we talk about small-scale fisheries, it's hard to wave the flag because quantifying the catch within small-scale fisheries or quantifying the contribution of small-scale fisheries is hard. That difficulty starts with definitional issues. What is a small-scale fishery? And goes from there on to how to capture those numbers. Small-scale fisheries by their nature are widely distributed, and for that reason alone are very hard to quantify. I want to talk briefly about a study that I conducted with under the ProFish program of the World Bank in collaboration with World Bank and FAO. Quite controversial in some circles because it was a study that actually looked at some of these miscountings, and obviously FAO reports what comes from countries, and then for them to come and say, hey, you haven't counted that right. It turned out to be a little bit controversial, and some of it kind of got sat on for political reasons, and I guess that's what happens when you get caught up in political organisations. But just to run a few headline figures there, total global catch, as I said, is around about 100 million tonnes. Now, of that, about 80 million tonnes for human consumption, and of that, some half of that is from the small-scale sector. Now, these numbers have been estimated by a number of different operators through a number of different methods. We used a method where basically we looked at the big producers and tried to capture, we conducted case studies amongst the bigger producing countries and looked at the total production from them and just tried to absolutely minimise the residual, if you like, where we didn't have case studies, and use some characteristics of the fisheries and social characteristics as extrapolation factors. I won't go any more into the methodology because we don't have time. So we're looking for the fish eaten directly by humans, not reduced for sort of secondary use. Small-scale fisheries provide around about half of it. Now, some really interesting stories are in the employment. Now, this is looking at full-time and part-time employment in the fisheries sector. It's not looking at subsistence fishers who fish for a few months of the year, people who are farmers who fish as part of their livelihood mix. This is employment within the sector. What you'll see between these two slides is that way. The same scene photographed from a different angle there. So this second slide brings in all the sort of ancillary jobs in behind, all the secondary livelihoods, if you like, the fish processors, the transport systems and so on. And that's where a lot of the interesting stories are. So total employment, full and part-time in the sector of around about 120 million people. The small-scale fisheries sector is around about 106 million. So it's hugely, it takes a massive majority of the employment there, and the small-scale fisheries in developing countries is 97% of that employment. So when we think about managing fisheries to look at their broader impact, including livelihood engagement, taking concepts that work within large-scale fisheries in developed countries and applying them to these small-scale fisheries in developing countries starts to look like a bit of a strange approach, because by far the biggest impact in terms of livelihoods is in these developing countries. Now, another interesting point here is that the gendered component there, so female employment comes in about 47% of total employment. So there's a really strong gendered engagement here. Now, obviously, a lot of that in most countries is in the processing sector and in the sales sector rather than directly in the fishing sector. I'm not sure if you can see that, but it's just making a point that this is hugely variable across countries. So looking at our different case studies, at the top there we have Nigeria with 73% female employment, down to Mozambique with 4%. And interestingly, Bangladesh sitting at 5%, and right next door, India sitting at 72%. So possibly sort of religious drivers involved there as well. So small-scale fisheries, wedged, squeezed, whatever you want to call it, there's a range of threats that I think we really have a case for making a special case for small-scale fisheries, that we should look at them as a separate sector and look at specificities of that sector in terms of how we govern them. So as we've said, undervalued because counting these things is really hard. Threats are both internal and external. There are hugely powerful actors operating in the marine space in particular. So you look at the oil and gas industries, you look at the development of tourism, the expansion of aquaculture, and you're getting a spatial squeeze on these small-scale fisheries, if you like. Weak and non-existent governance is a huge issue. We've already heard a bit about that from Tiffany, and also from Pete. Missing institutions at scale, so connecting communities up to more powerful actors at a higher level of governance. Efficiency and adaptability I've put there as a threat, and that might seem a bit odd, but the ability of small-scale fisheries to persist and to adapt in some areas becomes a threat to their own existence, and I'll explain that slightly more. And lastly, simplistic, often high-profile solutions promoted as the answer. So we're looking at things such as conservation NGOs saying marine protected areas will do this for you. We're looking at philanthropic NGOs that say markets are the way to go, Marine Stewardship Council, things like that. We're looking, I guess the larger actors with barrows to push in that space can cause some issues. So I'd like to just roll through some case studies I've been involved in some of those very quickly, as it turns out. Connected and inclusive governance is a huge issue. So we've already heard about that. Connecting communities, operating at the scale of matching scale of biology to the scale of governance and of management. This is a picture taken in Ghana at a site we were engaged with there, where there had been 130 co-management units set up around the coast 10 years ago. When we started working there were 2 left. And so there were some classic signs of what doesn't work there. We had to step into that space and try and talk about what does work. The inclusive side of it was a huge thing. So this picture shows working with the women, building capacity amongst the women who are more than half of the sector in Ghana. That was a process of approximately 2 years working towards having an inclusive governance conversation. So rather than stepping into this and saying we all need to get together and talk, there was a massive capacity building role to do first. This is one of the meetings where we're running a role play of fishing. The women from the communities are helping run that with the fisheries officers at the national level. So that's the level of capacity built here. This is one of our women telling one of these fisheries officers to go away because he's broken the rules in the marine protected area, which is defined by a green piece of string that you can't see there. So connected governance is huge there. Addressing distributional justice is a massive one. So who has the right to fish? Who has the capacity to fish? These photos are in East Timor, and we're looking at introduction or working with some of the communities who are already using fish aggregating devices, nearshore fish aggregating devices. Working in combination with strengthening local governance to build the exploitation of pelagic resources which have previously only been available to the larger boats. Now in East Timor, most of those larger boats disappeared at independence because they were burnt by the Indonesians as they left. So this is about getting effort off the reefs and onto pelagic resources in combination with local governance. And we have similar research going on across a number of countries in Solomon Islands, for example, as well. This can go horribly wrong, and just a quick example of that, again going back to Ghana, the government introduced light fishing. So fishing for pelagic, the Sardanella resource, going offshore, dropping lights deep. The idea of this was to fill the hungry season. So the Sardanella fishery was seasonal, and then they stepped back and said, well, if we use lights, we can fish year round. The picture there is one drawn by a local artist to be used in communities. Now, light fishing took off massively after a while, but then this is distance fished from home. So 10 years ago, 1 unit, these are arbitrary units. 5 years ago, 1.5 units, now 2.7 units. So they're fishing further and further from home, and the Sardanella fishery is collapsing. And the fishermen will tell us this is based on the light fishing, even the fishers who are using it. So taking that fishery out to a year-long fishery was disastrous for the fisheries. The seduction of simple solutions. Wealth-based fisheries management is one I'd hold up here. So World Bank have been pushing this idea that there's $50 to $100 billion lost globally annually based on foregone economic rents from fisheries. So increasing the efficiency of management and invariably involving privatisation. Illustrated by numerous success stories, including some from Tasmania. I would put forward that this should not and cannot be rolled out into the developing world. Looking at incentives to fish, we have fishermen who say, the ultimate disaster for me is if my kids have to fish. Put on top of that, in poverty settings, and this is stepping inland, but to a lake fishery, but you impose on that communities that are completely dependent on fishing, but say my highest priorities are not the fishing, are not related to the resource. So then you monetize the right to fish and you give it value amongst a community that sees basic food security and health needs as greatest. What they're going to do is sell that off. You're going to see the concentration of resources in a small number of hands, and that'll be a massive poverty trap for a big component of the population. I won't go there. So lessons that I take from this, a bit of an op-ed piece, as I said. Capture fisheries underpin global animal source food systems, particularly for the poor, and we should be making a special case for small-scale fisheries. We take our eyes off the ball at the peril of millions. Things such as saying aquaculture is the future because that's where things are expanding. See resources channeled in that direction. If you drop the ball on fisheries governance, there are disasters to be had there. Small-scale fisheries must be strengthened to maintain their place and to maintain a space to operate with really powerful actors in that domain. And that can only be happened by connecting governance across scales. Avoid the seduction of simplistic solutions. And ultimately, efficient, contextual engaged diagnosis partnered with well-researched and diverse set of tools tested across diverse settings is where we're moving. And that's a real challenge for people like us who work in that space of research, trying to get behind finding these case studies and putting decent research around them so we can have comparisons across sites. And I will leave it there.